this came to my world in watching news in which a correspondent has been asked the exact same question. Why does Trump want Greenland? And she is a commentator expert who was asked, and she said, the tech billionaires want to build their network states in Greenland. And so to someone who has never heard of this notion of the network state, it's just a byline. And you're just like, yeah, whatever, I didn't pick that up. Let's move on. Like they want resources, they want stuff. But for me, when I heard that, I almost fell off my chair because since I inhabit the weird worlds of crypto, the notion and the concept of the network state is familiar to me. And I have been watching the developments around this concept for quite some time. And so here it comes, full on the national news as what is driving Trump's Greenland politics. So I think that the proposition here would be to unpack that. So how come we hear this term and what does it mean and how do we go?
Andrea Leiter, welcome back to the Accidental Gods podcast. In a very changing world, how are you and where are you this Monday morning?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back with such a fantastic host like you. And I am currently in Austria looking out at very nice snowy weather. So that is not so bad, I would say, in this really, indeed, crazy world that we are in. Here it looks quite peaceful and nice.
Okay, I have snow envy. We have kind of sleet out there. It's grey and murky and very cold, but not cold enough to have snow. So anyway, such is the changing of the world. Since we last spoke, the world is moving fast. I thought we were going to be talking about protocols for post-capitalist expression, which I still would love to talk about because it is a really well worked out critique of capitalism, looking at how we might look at exchanging value differently. However, in the meantime, Trump and the people behind Trump, I think we can all agree that Trump is a useful idiot that they will continue to prod and push out on the world stage to do his crazy old man in the attic act until he ceases to be useful, at which point they'll get rid of him and we'll have Vance, who is much, much more scary, I would say. Partly because he knows why they're doing what they're doing. Trump's just a vacuum with a narcissist inside. But Vance is plugged into the people who want Greenland for very specific reasons, and they're not giving up. I think we all breathed a sigh of relief when it seemed like he was backing off. And given that I've read the early drafts of a paper you're producing, I don't think they're backing off. And nothing else suggests to me that they're backing off. They've just gone away to think about it a little bit more deeply. So we need to know why they're doing this. I think all of us, because I think it helps us to understand where geopolitics is going. And because we are an explicitly Throughtopian podcast, I would like us to look at how we might structure the world differently once we understand how certain people are trying to structure it. So, Andrea, explain to all of us in as simple terms as we can for people who aren't international legal lawyers, why do certain players in the American administration so dearly want to get hold of Greenland?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. And I think there are many parts to an answer to it. But let me just say that this came to my world in watching news on Austrian television, in which a correspondent has been asked the exact same question. Why does Trump want Greenland? And in her answer, her name is Miss Navidi. I will have to find her first name. But she is a commentator expert who was asked in the news. And she said, the tech billionaires want to build their network states in Greenland. And so to someone who has never heard of this notion of the network state, it's just a byline. And you're just like, yeah, whatever, I didn't pick that up. Let's move on. Like they want resources, they want stuff. But for me, when I heard that, I almost fell off my chair because since I inhabit the weird worlds of crypto utopianisms and dystopianisms, the notion and the concept of the network state is familiar to me. And I have been watching the developments around this concept for quite some time. And so here it comes, full on in on the national news as what is driving Trump's Greenland politics. So I think that the proposition here would be to unpack that. So how come we hear this term and what does it mean and how do we go? Yeah, sounds good.
Please go. Yes, yes. Let's unpack network state, because you're right. Those of us who have been on the fringes of this, yeah, it always struck me as a crazy notion. And because I thought it was crazy, I assumed everybody else thought it was crazy until I realized how much momentum was behind it. And the people with huge amounts of money think this is a really cool idea. Some of the people with huge amounts of money. But yes. Okay, so tell us about network states. Tell us about Balaji. Tell us about the proposition and then the unfolding of it.
Perfect. I mean, if you allow me to maybe just prompt all of this by saying that from the get-go of the re-election of Trump in his second term, the role of the crypto industry in his politics and in his maneuverings, I think has been largely underestimated. So we hear ever more of it, and he's been explicitly very loud with all of his crypto endeavors. I mean, there's no trying to hide anything.
He's not subtle, is he?
He's not subtle, exactly. But I think that just people have not paid much attention to it in the broad public debate. And so if we can just rewind for 1 second to say, even in the election, the crypto corporate donations that went into the 2024 elections were the biggest corporate donations recorded in the US until then. And so this was a really consolidated attempt at just making a very pro-crypto government possible in the US in both houses.
They supported both sides. I think that's important to say. They were playing both sides. Whoever got in owed them a lot of money.
Precisely. So on both sides, candidates who would take a pro-crypto stance were supported and were supported very successfully. And if we could visualize this, instead of seeing the typical image of a blue and red map, what we would see is just a crypto colored map, whatever color you want to give crypto on this, and almost entirely. So really, crypto came out as one of the biggest winners of this election. And there are a lot of facets to that, because in certain ways, it really also speaks a bit to a kind of financialization of the election process. An interesting bit of this puzzle, I just need to mention it because, again, I think that people are not paying attention to this, is that so-called prediction markets are accompanying this development, where you can make bets on whatever you want. And of course, one of the biggest events to bet on were the elections, and was this election. And so I think that the implications of what it means that people are betting on particular events to take place and have a financial stake in a particular outcome of this event changes everything about how they will go about achieving that result. So it's not just that it is a prognostic thing and saying, I think this Trump will win, and then I just put my hands into my lap and wait.
No, I think Trump will win. I bet on it, and then I try to make it happen.
Precisely.
And we could go down a rabbit hole. I spend quite a lot of time down a rabbit hole that says Trump won every swing state, in every swing county, in every swing state, by just enough to not trigger a hand count. And even Reagan didn't achieve this. And I have some quite smart people that seem to know what they're saying. The odds of that happening are 1/10 to the power 88. And he pretty much stood up the day after the election and said, Elon Musk is amazing, he knows all about electronics, and we won Pennsylvania. And the thing about Trump is there's no filter. He says what he thinks, and what he thought was Musk won the election for him. And Stalin said a long time ago, it doesn't matter who votes, it matters who counts the votes. And nowadays, I would say it doesn't even matter who counts the votes, it matters who collates the data about the counting of the votes. And so it's way too late. And I still don't understand why Kamala Harris and her team did not require hand counts when the person who had headed Biden's crypto security detail put out an open letter saying you need to have hand counts, and they didn't. And why not? It wouldn't have hurt. But anyway, so there was a lot of, as you're saying, crypto bros who were very, very, very happy that Trump won. I gather I have a friend who was on a cruise ship. There was a cruise ship going from somewhere in Europe to somewhere in the Americas, I think Panama, at the time of the election. And it was empty. And so a bunch of people took it over and brought in people from right across the spectrum of politics to be on a ship. And I gathered there was quite an interesting response when the results came in, because this ship was cruising, and someone we both know of, Primavera de Felipe, was on there, but so were a whole bunch of very, very alt-right network state people who were celebrating a lot until people started to explain to them what it might mean. So they basically bought the election. I think we need to say out loud that we have the best democracy money can buy, and they have a lot of money. We don't have a democracy. We have a kleptocracy. We haven't ever had the democracy, in inverted commas, that was never designed to give ordinary people any sense of actual decision-making power. And what's different now is that tech people have most money instead of oil people. And before that, it was coal people or railroad people or people who enslaved other people. It's always been whatever is the latest iteration of imperialism has owned the power and has pretended to lease to the general population a degree of power. Would you say that was fair?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you have continuities in many ways. I also think that in that sense, the question of corporate money in US elections has always been difficult. There's this famous ruling of Citizens United of 2010 of the Supreme Court that, of course, was a landmark in the sense of enabling corporate power to have a large influence. So it's not utterly novel what we are seeing with the crypto industry interventions in the US elections, but I think that it points us toward, I would say, a different mode in which it is being done. That's why I would say that it's really, in a certain way, a financialization of sovereignty in a way that we haven't seen before. So this prediction market example, I think operates differently to how corporate donations would have operated before. Also, with the fact that you can, in a sense, I mean, what is also almost it's really ironic. So all of that money that went into supporting the elections, what you had as a result of Trump being elected was, of course, a big increase in the price of all cryptocurrencies across the board. And also the crypto markets went up. They got it back within such a fast turnaround. So it would always be a quid pro quo. No, you spend money in order to make money. I mean, this is nothing new under the sun. But the sheer quantity and also the short amount of time that it takes, it just points us to phenomena that I think we are also not fully equipped to respond to. What do we make of this? Where's the problem exactly? How do we frame this? So I think that is one thing that we saw in the election with the role of the crypto industry. And I would also insist on making a second point here that I think is much more uncomfortable, because I think looking at this and saying, well, these crazy people and this crazy industry and these crazy bros, what are they doing? It's always quite a low-hanging fruit. No, I mean, crypto is amazing like that. You can just shoot it down every 3 seconds because it's insane what people are doing, parts of the ecosystem. But I think what is important also is that there is a real question of the voters who turned to particular representatives because they came out pro-crypto. I mean, it's not just a one-way street. There's also something about having spoken to a constituency that kind of reconfigured itself. There was a lot of debate about why male, Latino, and Black voters would have turned Republican, why some of the core democratic camps would have turned a Republican. And I think that, again, here also, we don't understand what crypto means in that respect. It means a quick bet on maybe securing some financial gain in the future. This is not a wholesome society that we are heading toward. But I think for people who are living in precarity, I mean, who's going to blame the attempt at making some bucks? So I think this is another side of that. And I think it's important to keep those two things together, because that also explains why people might be following with these ideas and why people might be clocking onto this. And I think rather than making yet a grand abyss of the idiots over there and we, the enlightened ones, over here, I think there's just really like what's at stake here is the question of how do you secure a future? How do you do that? Who do you entrust with building a vessel and a container that will do that for you? And so as much as I disagree with everything, and I think that it's horrific, the direction that we are going, I think that the question of where and who do we turn to for this is one that is really a real one and a big one. And so with having said that other part of the puzzle of why crypto, I think has had an appeal and continues having an appeal to a particular segment of society, maybe then to say that indeed since then Trump was elected successfully, and since there is this very successful there's very pro-crypto political landscape in the US, they have also indeed been good at bringing out legislation that is extremely favorable. So on the one hand, regulatory acts, the Genius Act that revolves around stablecoins is one part of the story. We can maybe touch on this.
Could you unpick that for us a little bit in a minute, but go through?
Yeah, so maybe the Genius Act we put to the last, even though I mentioned it first, because I think it's the most far-reaching, but just on more minor things. Now, the head of the SEC was exchanged. So Gary Gensler went out, who was very skeptical of crypto. And in that vein, also a lot of cases against crypto industry players were either settled or were dropped or were... So in many ways, there was a very obvious pro-crypto industry outing. And then indeed, on the legislative acts, I think what is important is the Genius Act, also the name, carries Trump all over it, no? And that act is relevant because the Trump family went very explicitly into crypto endeavors already before the election with their company, World Liberty Financial. And in order for this company to do the things that they wanted to do, the Genius Act was crucial.
And what did they want to do?
Because it allows them to bring what is called a stable coin. And a stable coin is a cryptocurrency that is pegged to a different value that can either be what is technically called fiat currencies, so state-backed currencies like the US dollar, mainly the US dollar, can also be other currencies, or it can be gold, silver, whatever kinds of resources
whatever you think
want,
is most stable.
or it can also be a mix of cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
So there are different setups for these stable coins, how they are used. But in order to be allowed to issue that, which is a certain form of private money, shadow banking, if you wish, a version of shadow banking, the Genius Act really opened the path toward that and enabled that strongly. Where we are going with stablecoins on the horizon, it's a very complicated question. I think it's yet another of these bigger puzzle pieces that should not be just seen as, well, some lunacy to get rich. I think much rather it should really be understood that it is a question of where are we headed with US dollar hegemony.
Right.
It's in decline for some time in different ways. People have been thinking, speaking, and writing about this. The stablecoins that are issued by a private company of the Trump family, but are pegged to the US dollar and are advanced and advertised by Donald Trump in his double function of being the president of the United States, but also being the founder of this company. I mean, it's too complex and complicated to really have a straightforward sense of where does that take us.
Okay, but could we just, I think this is a useful thing to map out because nobody else is going to talk about this with me, so thank you. So we have Mr. I am a very stable genius creating private money. He's basically giving himself a license to counterfeit something that could be like dollars, it could be like gold. I listened to James Meadway's Macrodose podcast last week, 2 weeks ago, and he was very clearly laying out that China is accelerating its move to make its currency, the renminbi, be the global fiat currency. And we tagged to this Douglas Rushkoff, who in lockdown or before lockdown was invited to a place in the middle of the desert, the most expensive hotel he'd ever been to in his entire life. And he thought he was there to give a talk about futurism. And 3 blokes in suits turned up in what he thought was the green room. And after a while, he realized this was the talk. These were his audience. And they were explicitly asking him how they would control their private armies at the point when the event happened. And the event was the collapse of the dollar. And he suggested that they should start making friends with their private armies. And in the end, they got down to, do we kidnap their families and hold them? But no, that means we'd have to feed them. So actually, we're going to use electronic collars to control them. These people are actual psychopaths. But what I took away from that was they are expecting the dollar to collapse. So they are creating a parallel currency that they own and they issue in order to protect themselves against dollar collapse. And I have always thought that the day we can make the dollar worth 0 and the pound and the euro, all of these people are basically ordinary people again. If you have $1 trillion and the dollars aren't worth anything, then you just basically don't even have a pile of paper that you could burn. You have numbers on a computer screen that are worthless. However, they are in the process of trying to create value exchange systems and value storage systems that are independent of other global fiat currencies. And it seems to me that these are only worth anything if everybody agrees. That's the point of a fiat currency. Everybody agrees that $1 is worth $1 and that $1 can buy a certain amount of stuff. Because you can't eat dollars, you can't eat gold. You can't drink it if water's gone. Coins of any sort only have value if we all agree they have value, or somebody with a very big army can tell you that they have value, which is, as far as I'm concerned, how coins began, is the Romans or whoever turned up with a lot of blokes with swords and said, this thing with Nero's head on it is worth more than a little bit of silver of the same size, and you will agree, or we will steal your children and crucify you and turn your kids into slaves. And we're basically back to that. The people with the biggest armies get to impose their version of value exchange, and they're busy siphoning it out of dollars into something else. How does a stablecoin or anything else maintain its value if the only people who say it has value are the people who have stablecoins?
Yeah, I mean, it's really complicated, man. It's a difficult, I think, monetary theory. Like, honestly, sometimes I feel like I've been trying to keep up, but I'm out of my depth in certain ways, I have to say, with this, because I think that you don't only have the question of how is a stable coin worth something, which would be the question of how is Bitcoin worth something, or how is Ethereum, or like that's already a complicated question, or why is a dollar worth something, to come at it from that. But with stable coins, you have this creature that on the one hand rides on the stability of a fiat currency, namely the US dollar, which means that it also rides on the capacity of a public spending body to be a backstop. So in many ways, the stability comes from the fact that public fund will ultimately cover the losses, no matter what happens. No, so this is a bit the tricky thing. Whereas you do, and then you have public authority over that money, and then this is how it goes. That's why it's public money, because you can have both the spending and the backstopping in one democratically controlled kind of way. I think that would be the argument for why money should always be public. And if you have now coupled that to a cryptocurrency token, which also runs on a different kind of infrastructure, the question of how is it really pegged? Like if there is a run on the USD1 token that Trump holds, how is that secured through fiat dollar currency? I have to say, I'm reaching the limits of how I can understand what will lead to what and what will trigger what. And I think that we will have to see how this plays out. I think that a lot of the innovation in the stablecoin space happens precisely around these questions. What is the safe stablecoin? What is not? There was the Terra Luna collapse in relation to the FTX, the Bankman-Fried collapse, where the algorithmic stabilization of the stablecoin did not hold. So there is a lot of experimentation, a lot of complexity and depth, I think, in that. But what I do think where we can, I guess, say something meaningful rather than losing ourselves in complexity and steering away is, I think, so one way of explaining the origin of money would be from what is called the constitutional theory of money. There are scholars, particularly in the US, who have advanced this kind of knowledge. Christine Desan is one of the thinkers who is most important at Harvard Law School, who would trace historically the coming into being of money more to the existence of a community that takes that particular coin value description as something that is valuable within that community, that can be traced as either paying soldiers, you fight and I pay you in this coin, and then I accept the tax that you owe me also in this coin. So it constitutionalizes through the fact that that token is valuable in an exchange between the community and the people who want to contribute to it. And in that sense, it's interesting to think also about cryptocurrencies along these lines. And also, if you think of Ethereum, for example, if you want to engage with the Ethereum ecosystem, you need to have Ether and you pay a particular gas fee. So it's a bit like that, no? It's a bit like I want to play along with Ethereum. I want to be part of the system. I want to be able to use that particular currency in order to access all of the things that Ethereum enables. And so I have to buy into that. I have to get this kind of currency and I have to spend it in order to interact with the system. And part of its value comes from this logic in which you need it in order to interact with it. So you have a utility in it with the system. And now again, to come a bit back to the question of the Trump token and what is that, I think that there is something that is meaningful to say is that at least, so to be very careful here to not overstate. So this USD1 stablecoin of Trump, the question will be who uses it and for what? And how do we make it useful? No, how do we bring it so that it becomes really engaged with in the larger economy? So then there is reporting which tries to put together two separate deals that have happened. One is that an Abu Dhabi investment fund, technology investment fund, made an investment into Binance, which is a US-based crypto exchange. While at the same time, the US struck a deal with Abu Dhabi about NVIDIA chips. So this NVIDIA deal was not paid in US dollar Trump, but that previous deal of the Abu Dhabi investment fund into Binance was a $2 billion deal in the denominated Trump coin. It's not, you cannot really, people are careful to say, is this connected? Is it not? The New York Times, they were separate deals, but the New York Times has put a lot of effort in trying to show the overlapping timeline and all sorts of things. So they haven't come out saying straightforward, this is it, but they said, look, there is a lot that allows us to say there is something happening. So in that sense, it's interesting because then the USD1 becomes the means of payment, the means of settlement for like big term deals. And now just recently at the end of January, Pakistan's central bank is now exploring the use of USD1 in its payment system. So we're seeing that indeed USD1 as a means of settlement for payments is being pushed in different ways and different things. And this is, I think, familiar again to make a longer lineage in oil concession agreements. back at the beginning of the 20th century and mid-20th century, one way in which the dollar became so powerful over the US pound was by making it the means of settlement in all concession agreements, in which it was clear you have to make this payment in the currency of the US dollar and not British pound. And so, not to overstretch, but just to say as an analytic analogy, in order to try understand, in the same way that you said, oil has its role and had its role historically. Where do we see crypto? I think one of the things in which we can understand the role of these stable coins and the Trump-backed stable coin is when we see it pop up as the means of settlement for these big deals. And we are just seeing the beginning of that. But I think this is when it really becomes serious. And we are seeing the early days of that. So this is a long-winded and complicated, multifaceted answer, but I think this is a bit to understand and locate the US stablecoin endeavor, and indeed in the relationship to China and what China is doing and how the US is trying to raise that. I would not dare to predict things here, but certainly this is how the game is being set up.
Wow. Okay, and even reading your paper, I hadn't really got to the depths of that. So where we're at, if we take this down to absolute basics, is that throughout history, the person who had the power to create the currency, whatever the currency was, whether it was sesterces in Rome or UK pounds, at the point when it was no longer linked to actual physical metals, which were in limited supply, then the person who could generate the bits of paper, or now the bits on a screen, that had value was the person who controlled that value and had most of it. And what it sounds like is that the stable coins are an attempt to remove that control from the nation state of the US and put it in the hands of a family and those in their orbit, which would make them god emperors of whatever expanse began to use that currency. At the point when it's no longer, because the US has been the most powerful nation on earth for a long time because it controlled issuance of the dollar. And it could issue more dollars at any point when it felt like it, and thereby make itself richer. It's just, we make the money and we have as much money as we want. And now a different political entity is striving to make money that may supplant the dollar, particularly if the dollar is undermined by the Chinese. Let's leave that, because we wanted to get onto the nation state and the network state. Because so what we have in the world nation states, and I think it's worth going back to Hobbes' definition of a nation state as that geopolitical entity which gives itself a monopoly on the use of violence within certain geographic borders. So the Americans can have ICE in Minnesota doing things that are utterly appalling, and it says that's fine because we are the government. And if you even stand there, we can kill you because that's our legal monopoly on violence. And if you look like you're doing anything else back, then we can also kill. And it's pretty explicit now. There were, even a year ago, you'd have had trouble having something quite so obvious to define that. But we've been doing this around the world, the white Western nations, for many, many centuries. And actually the Romans did it 2,000 years ago, and they were not the inventors of it. They were just quite good at exporting it around Western Europe. So a monopoly of violence within certain geographic borders. That's the nation state. The network state takes that in a new direction. Tell us a little bit about Balaji and the network state and how it's evolving and why Greenland is critical to the vision of it.
Yeah, so the network state is an idea that was proposed and indeed, I would say, floated in a book that has become now, and a website that has become now really strongly associated with this name, Balaji Srinivasan. So this was 2022 and was drawing really strongly on cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology as an affordance that enabled such a construction. And basically what the proposition is that you can basically have a virtual community first. So the first element is a however coming together virtual community that then slowly and steadily, as he says it so nicely, crowdfunds territory around the globe to develop a community that is rooted in a decentralized way in different places, and that indeed, at the end of the day, should have the status of something like a sovereign state. And I think, there's much to be said about the history of international law. I'm an international lawyer. This is like just too much that I want to say all in one about how do we think about this. But I think to just move slowly and to unfold what the idea of this proposition is first, to then see how does this relate to international law and to the history of international and so forth. I would say that indeed, I think that it picks up on something that is relevant. Online communities, virtual communities do play an emerging role on how we socially relate to each other. I think also in the Western world, digital nomadism is a real thing. So people are doing this. COVID was an accelerator for this in many ways. And I think that, again, to keep it as real as possible, the question of where does that leave the question of how individuals secure their lives is an open question. In the Web3 space, precarity is enormous, and people have studied this. Now, what is the precarity of Web3 workers? Because basically you end up having no more health insurance. You are not like in any pension fund. You are not in any all of these real things that hold life when we operate in this mobile and virtual way become difficult questions to answer. So now the network state is not a response to this per se. The network state is rather, I think, coming from the backdrop of saying we high achieving individuals want to come together and lose the shackles of the demand that these democracies make on us and just be really successful and rich and great together without having to take care of anyone else. But I wanted to prompt that with the digital nomadism and the virtual communities, because I always would like to keep the vision straight that we are straddling a very thin line here. And it's not just, again, straightforward, those over there and we over here. It's a phenomenon that is enmeshed in really transitions that I think we need to respond to, not with their response, but with a different response. So the network state is that proposition. And I think that if we anchor it in its intellectual history, we can also see a bit better where it comes from and what it is and what it's not. So here, what is important is, on the one hand, the people that are pushing that from a philosophical perspective. And I think here we would have to look into an institute that is called the Seasteading Institute, which was founded by Patrick Friedman, who is the grandson of Milton Friedman, and has received enormous funding from Peter Thiel, and has really had this idea of I would say, libertarian fantasy of having a lot of jurisdictions, small jurisdictions, seasteading, because the high seas, which is nobody's territory, would be the place to go for this.
So we need to be clear for people listening who are
Yes.
phonetic that this is CSEA, steading. Also, if anybody's interested, there's a very interesting novel called Venomous Lumpsucker, which looks into seasteads quite in a way that makes them more obvious what they are. But basically, it's let's not quite take cruise ships, but let's create floating islands in places that are not owned by anybody else, so that it's largely to be free of any kind of regulation and any kind of taxation. It seems to me it's the obvious philosophical extension of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is huge. And even in the days when I was working in computer games companies, everybody read Atlas Shrugged and thought it was a really good thing, and except me. And I was like, what? But there's a particular worldview, and particularly in young men, who are dissociated completely from any concept of being an integral part of the web of life, who want to be unshackled by what they see as any kind of responsibility to anyone for anything. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's fair. And I think that the trajectory that you're drawing to Ayn Rand is precisely spot on. So I think it does really come from this proposition of having these. I think a good slogan that would hold this together is no death, no taxes, no democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think this is really
Yes.
the tripartite that is
Yes.
being chased, and no death, I think, really in terms of like longevity research, all sorts of things of how to live longer for the very particular ones who can then afford these things. So this is, I think, and then no taxes. Really, this is the cue here. How do we make it so that we don't have to pay taxes? And no democracy. And I think here what is interesting and what is worthwhile, I think, noticing is that the proposition of how this governance should work is something that would be corporate governance. So let's
This
do
is
public
Curtis Yarvin on
governance.
steroids.
Is precisely Curtis Yarvin, and this is precisely the lineage again. That is really, I would say, extremely authoritarian, and has a euthanasia, has a taste of euthanasia. So it's like, which particular people do we need and which
Right.
ones do we not need is baked into
Yes.
this, particularly
Yes.
in versions of Curtis Jarvin, who, if you read his writings, you would find that he would shrug it off and say, oh, I'm just playing around and I'm just being silly and making jokes here. But I think it's really written in there that there is a supremacy idea, that there is an idea of a particular kind of human that should be life extended and should be dominating the
And
world.
they're white and male and technocratic.
Precisely.
Which is interesting, given that Balaji was not white, but it seems to have, they still think he's a cool guy. Some of them think he's a cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think Balaji's rhetoric is interesting because he positions himself explicitly as someone who says, for all of us who do not hold Western passports, this proposition is an important proposition. So again, the political spectrum is complicated to navigate. There's bits and pieces of everything lying in here, where you would say super left progressive language comes with hard or outright propositions. And to decipher that is precisely the task at hand. So that's why putting the network state in this libertarian lineage is the way to go in order to understand where we are going and what is driving on. And I think that to now come full circle as to why does this matter? Why do we talk about it? And it's the fantasy of these weird people. One is, of course, they amass enormous amounts of capital. I mean, that is just a given
fact. They may be weird,
fact.
but they're very, very rich.
Very, very rich, precisely. Yeah. And then the network state becomes, from an international law perspective, again, a proposition that is worth noticing because it's a vehicle of choice for how to crowdsource territory is something that we know for many, many years in international law, so-called special economic zones. Or you can call it all sorts of zones, which basically, as was described very beautifully and extremely easy to read by historian Quinn Slobodian, who has really also followed the mindset of these people. There's a book called Crack Up Capitalism. He's very prolific. He has 3 very good books. Shout out. The Globalists, Crack Up Capitalism, and then Hayek's Bastards, that he published in short succession. But Crack Up Capitalism for this discussion is particularly important because what he says is that even though we have this, let's say, Hobbesian, or let's rather put it the Westphalian idea of what a nation state is, and that the globe is basically composed of nation states that are territorially bound and that come together in this family of nations, as the beautiful euphemism goes. He says that was never the case. We always had a globe that had these sovereign states, but was poked through a million little zones that have special status, zones of exception of all sorts of kinds. And he traces that historically from, places like Shanghai after the Opium Wars being a particular jurisdiction, to Hong Kong as another dream of how do we build this in a different century. So, it really, like, you can go through the centuries and you can see these different tiny little zones that always had a particular status. And I think that's the way we need to look at it. I think he's spot on with saying there was never such a smooth thing as just, the way that we see the map with all of these beautiful lines, and that's just how it goes. And it's particularly capitalism that needs these zones of exception, that needs to have the possibility of poke these holes to gain a competitive advantage, to be able to accumulate unencumbered, to escape regulation, attempts of redistribution, all of the things that we would want from a strong, less regulatory state apparatus were always escaped through these zones. And this is where now the network state basically just comes in as yet another iteration of claiming such a jurisdiction for itself. And now here comes, I think, the part where we really need to start paying attention. If we follow the negotiations of peace negotiations in Ukraine, in Gaza, announced for next week. I mean, maybe by the time this airs, Trump has put up his new plan on what should happen in Gaza, but special economic zones and the rights of what happens in these special economic zones, that's where the juicy bits will be.
So tell us a little bit more about the detail of what, if they were able to do this in Ukraine or Gaza, and they were setting up special economic zones in cities in the UK at the end of the last Conservative administration. And I actually haven't looked at what they were doing there, but they did not sound fun. They had their own police force. They had a completely different taxation system that was basically private. And it looks like this is what Project 2025 is trying to do with the whole of the US. But let's take Gaza or Ukraine. Actually, let's just take Gaza. Netanyahu has quite clearly endeavored to wipe it out, to just remove all of the people from there. And then they go in and they clear all the rubble, they build their new special economic zones. What really frightens me about all of this is that as far as they're concerned, we have a stable climate, and we really don't have a stable climate. But leaving that aside, they create a special economic zone. What happens inside a special economic zone from their point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly as you said, and just to say it explicitly out loud, first and foremost, it's a genocidal project often, and it's a giant dispossession project. So it starts from there, no? And it very much likes to, and I think that if we look at Greenland, especially, for example, I just have to throw that in the mix because this is where this is negotiated as well. As if it was a terra nullius. I mean, in Greenland, they really pretend it's just a big, what did he say? It's just a big block of ice. So, even like the physical territory is not acknowledged. So it is always, it always comes in this language that is genocidal and non-recognizing the peoples and things that are where all these special economic zones should be. And so it continues this story of neo-colonial dispossessions. And then the question becomes, of course, then it becomes again, as I would say, intricate technical legal arrangement of what exactly is supposed to happen there. And I would say if you see jurisdiction as something that has a lot of layers, then I think you can just see what kind of composition of these layers will be there. You'll have different branches in law. No, you mentioned police force. I mean, you have the executive, that is always what is the administrative and indeed police force questions. This is often remains, especially the executive, often remains untouched with special economic zones. So that's really as far as you can go to really say, like, we are not respecting your police force, we are not respecting your criminal code. That is really extreme, but also that exists, so that you can even plug out that completely.
So we go into Gaza, we create a space which has boundaries. We're back to a geopolitical space within which we, the executive, claim a monopoly on legal violence, and we will impose that because we will fund ICE effectively in our space. Is that, and then we get to say
so
what
that
happens.
might be. So we will have to see what they come up with. We have no idea how far that will go. But at least I would say that even if you leave, and this will, I think, at the end of the day, it does play a big role. What is with the executive? What is the monopoly of violence and in which way? But even just on the, let's say, more economic side of things, the question of tariffs, the question of taxes, and then, of course, the question of regulation for all sorts. Because again, when we come back to our triad of no death, no taxes, no democracy, health regulation, research possibilities on all sorts of things to just get that out of the way. I think these are, broadly speaking, the things that are being pursued. And I have to say, I know too little about the negotiations that are taking place around Gaza, but there was already last year, the Tony Blair Institute was criticized so strongly for bringing out a token, to make land purchase available through tokenizing land. So we have had a bit forebearers of what is to come. We will see. We have to wait and see what will come in this written proposal. But what we do know is all the special economic zone that has crypto flavor that has been around for some time in Honduras. So I think it's a good example to look at what have they done there rather than to speculate what will they be doing, because we just have to see. But to say we have to have our eyes on it, that's the important part. So in Honduras, even before crypto was the name of the game, I don't know exactly, 2016 maybe, I guess, something around that, the Honduran government granted special economic zone rights in the Bay Islands, in particular in Roatan, one of the Bay Islands there, to a group of venture capitalists who basically had a proposition of saying, we will have a very efficient kind of run jurisdiction here. So if you come and build your business here, you have much less red tape. We'll just get you started much faster. Your taxes are low. We also have a different kind of judicial system for settling commercial disputes. So you will just have a fast track commercial dispute settling system. So that's typically what special economic zones are. They are very business friendly zones. No taxes in the one digit, all sorts of efficiencies for running business. And
super hell for anybody working there who isn't running a business.
So this is now where all the things come. So this place in Honduras has the beautiful name Prospera. So it's really almost cynical to call it that. And indeed, the big question of how does that relate to the population who already lives and has their lives there is the first question. So there were no dispossessions outright, as far as I can tell from Prospera, as I understand. There were land was purchased in contract agreements, but again, where is the equality of bargaining power here is a big question. And so this has been developing, and then crypto became a big part of that. So there's a Bitcoin center on the island. Longevity research became very important. There's a lot of work around researching medication and of all sorts of kinds of new drugs. And all of that then got repealed when a new government came in Honduras. So Honduras brought in a socialist government and repealed, also with accompanied by really big public protests, the special economic zone rights. Now people would say this is like quasi-ceding sovereignty, what we have done here. This is not right. We shouldn't be doing this. We need to repeal all this. And so the government did repeal these special economic zone rights. But then comes the catch. A catch where, again, good old international law shows
ISDS.
its ugliest face. Precisely, you called it ISDS, International Dispute
Settlement, which is the biggest con on the planet. I mean, they should just say no. You just say, no, we're not doing that. It should not be possible for ISDS to exist. You're going to have to explain what ISDS is, because my brain is already exploding. Tell us about ISDS in layman's simple terms.
So ISDS is a short version for calling a legal system, an international legal system that is called international investment law. And basically international investment law, I would put it this way. This was the topic of my PhD and the first book that I published on how to make the world safe for investment, in which I traced a bit, where did this legal regime come from? Like, how on earth did we get there? Precisely because you would think in, again, this picture of the globe that we have with all of these sovereign states, right, that are the lords of their territories, and they have, permanent sovereignty over natural resources, and they are the legislators and all of these things. That's the image that we have. And in this image, in the moment in which we would see socialist revolutions and the big wave of decolonization at the beginning of the 20th century, this idea that the sovereign state should be the ultimate arbiter, so to speak, on what happens within a state territory was challenged precisely because if you would look at either Eastern European states, the Soviet Union, when it first came to be after the revolution, of course, and then of course also through in former colonies, if you would look around, what is the state of property in these places, you would have a lot of foreign investment. You would have a lot of companies who own a lot of the industry, who own big chunks of land, you call it. So if you basically are the president after the revolution or after decolonization and you step onto your presidential balcony and you look around, what you see is a lot of foreign held property.
But then you could just take it back.
So then you try to take it back, precisely. So you try to take it back and you do it with you're not crazy. You say we make compensation schemes for this. We try to calculate. We try to see what we can do. So you do it all with due process and all of the things, but that's not good enough.
Right.
And the question of how do you even calculate who benefited from this, in which ways, were really big. I mean, Iran is a big example for that, where British Petroleum was nationalized back then, with indeed an offer of compensation, which ended in a coup.
Yeah, they just deposed it. Yes.
Same story in Chile, same story in many places. So this is the very violent part of that. But what was happening in the meantime is that I would say a bunch of smart lawyers in the service of corporates and former colonial powers managed to develop a very intricate, smart system that we now call investment law, that at the end of the day basically elevates the jurisdiction over these foreign property holdings from the national level to the international level. That's the move that investment law allows, that it's no longer a question of sovereign decision-making. It's now a question that has to be adjudicated in an arbitral tribunal. So they have these ad hoc decision-making bodies, and the law
which have three people, all of whom are
arbitrators
from the industry, and you don't get to see how and why they make their decisions. It's a con. Why does anybody allow it, Andrea?
So, I mean, it's again, I would be more nuanced with this in many ways as well. I mean,
okay, you did your PhD in this, yes.
There is a body of law that they apply. The question of, has this been approved? How has this been consented to? You do have bilateral investment treaties. So at some point, Honduras did sign a treaty in which they agreed to these rules. This was, in the case of Honduras, this is CAFTA, or this is a regional investment treaty, because indeed the idea is to be able to lure foreign investment into the country to develop all sorts of things. No? So if you want to build an economy, you need capital, you need resources, you need machines, you need knowledge, you need all of these things. So again, when you stand on your presidential balcony, you ask yourself, how do I get this? And then you might be inclined to enter into an agreement like that says we will protect the investments that you make here, and we will not treat them arbitrarily. Now, what is arbitrarily and what isn't? It's a complicated field, but at the end of the day, I completely agree with you that this has been to the disadvantage of countries of the global south, by and large, 100%, to a great disadvantage. People are trying to get out of the system. Many have indeed stepped away from the system. Honduras had stepped out, but they are still bound because there's something like a sunset clause. You cannot just leave. Now they have stepped back into it because they have again a new government. So we will see what will happen. So it's a complicated, messy story, but let's bring it back to what is happening with Prospera, one of the biggest examples for what a network state could develop into. The special economic zone rights, when they were taken away They just sued Honduras for 11 billion. And the case is pending. It's
Right.
ongoing.
Right.
So
and I'm
I
guessing
really,
Honduras' total GDP is not 11 billion.
exactly. So this is, one of the poorest economies is being sued for such a giant amount in the name of what exactly? Prospera? What? So this is the crux of it. So I think that we need to understand that these negotiations of special economic zones, the question of what is a network state doing there, how does this operate, has a lot of different layers. We have the layer of international law that is here and is standing and has for a long time been protecting foreign capital and has mechanisms to do so that are not so easy to change. And
Unless
this
you're
is
Donald Trump, when he seems to just ignore international law. I mean, this seems to be, international law gets to be what you say it is if you have the dollar behind you. Is that not the case?
Yes, but it's also the case that this particular regime of investment law, what you need to know about this is that there is a convention that is its sibling. It's called the New York Convention, doesn't matter, which makes it so that if you have an award from one of these arbitral tribunals against you as a state, so let's say now Honduras gets indeed this arbitral tribunal finds that they do owe 11 billion. What happens is that there is a convention, international convention that many states are part of, that forces these states to execute this award in any country. So Honduran property around the globe that is not used in official capacity, that is not it can be the consulate, but that is in private usage, but is officially owned by the state of Honduras, has to be executed against the amount of this award. So this is why this international investment law system has a lot of bite compared to many other rules in international law that we see disappearing
Right,
these
because
days.
it's going to hit the people right at the top. It's not going to hit your average peasant farmer because they don't have property in Paris. But the people who make the laws and who have made those decisions might do.
And the state has property. Yeah? The state just owns property against which you can execute. So this is a bit, and again, with a lot of nuance, and we're moving like a trailblazer through a lot of complicated things. But to set this up, I think this is how we need to understand. So there is the core layer that has been there for a long time and has been there before, special economic zones, colonial property holdings that then form into foreign property holdings. How are they protected, have been protected through investment law all along? We know this. What is new? Why is this relevant to now? And why should we watch these special economic zones? Is that indeed with this network state idea, the proposition of crowdsourcing territory now. So we hear the Tony Blair Institute speaking of like tokenizing the land. This is a new kind of conversion of the technological affordances of blockchain technology in this very particular libertarian gaze, with now the combination of a president who is super pro crypto and who is leading peace negotiation and can negotiate on territory peace, can negotiate on territory with enormous force.
Right. And let's move this to Greenland. What are they planning? So they want Greenland. They want to own Greenland. They want to take Greenland by force if necessary. And frankly, if they really decide to do that, they'll just fly as much people as they need into Thule Air Base, and Greenland is theirs. I don't see the rest of the world declaring World War III over Greenland. I think if they wanted Canada, it might be different. But even then, it's hard to see the rest of the world standing against them. So they take Greenland. What do they do with it then? They turn the whole of Greenland into a special economic zone.
I mean, I think this is where I think they can afford not to be so violent. I mean, I think this is where they can backtrack. It's perfectly okay for them not to have to take Greenland in a military way and not to blow up NATO and put everyone against them and put this probe. I think that, to me, I mean, this is my reading of these negotiations, is that they just realized we don't need to do it that way. We make it via the art of the deal. Right? It's much easier.
Who in
So
their right
in that
minds makes a deal
sense,
with Donald Trump? I mean, honestly. But go on.
but this is, I think that they will propose a deal that just says, these particular parts, and I mean, it has been scoped. I don't know the geography of Greenland sufficiently to be able to locate where they have an interest. who lives there, what that means, how this is going to go down. But they have been scoping what is relevant, what is important, which areas, which territories. And indeed, I think we will have to see what comes in terms of what are the propositions, which kinds of laws and national regulations will be taken out through saying we establish a special economic zone here. What kind of rights they will give themselves. I don't think they will give themselves any obligation. I think they will only give themselves rights, and what they will be able to get there, we will see. But the proposition of having a tax regime that is independent for share. Exactly. So again, if we think of no death, no taxes, no democracy, we'll see a bit of a roadmap of what is relevant to them. And I think, that is what is at stake at the moment. And I think that everyone who is involved on the policy level in these, all the international lawyers, so to speak, and foreign ministry people, I don't think that they have this on the radar so clearly.
Okay. We could continue down that rabbit hole, but I'd rather leave listeners with something a little bit more utopian. Because we are hitting biophysical limits. That's the thing. When Steve Bannon first proposed this 10,000-year Reich, I thought I could be really scared about this, but actually they're ignoring the fact that we're hitting climate tipping points, and Trump has just ripped up all of the regulation in the US relating to anything about any kind of environmental regulation, which is truly horrible. But also, there seems to be an accelerationist mindset within the crypto bros, which is let's get this over, because they've read too many dystopian science fiction fantasy where they think that there will be survivors, and they will be the survivors, and they'll get rid of everybody else, and that'll be just fine, and they'll carry on in their pristine world, which is somehow, they just don't understand what actual biophysical collapse means, I think, because they do live in really separate spaces. And someone that I follow on Blue Sky said recently, you're all wondering what happens after the network state and why would we join a network state, and you don't understand that these people exist already in a network state, and what they're doing is siphoning value from the whole of the rest of the world into their existing crypto spaces and digital spaces. And the fact that they might be in San Francisco or Cupertino or Hong Kong or Singapore is irrelevant. They are, as far as they're concerned, they're in a space that they control. And the living world is an aesthetic option that they can choose not to have, which is a level of disconnect that does weird things to my head, but it exists. So we exist in a world where biophysical limits exist, and we're racing towards tipping points beyond which I don't see complex life surviving, and humans are pretty complex. So if we were to design a new way, it seems to me the nation state has had its day. The nation state is a relatively recent evolution of human cultural biology that exists when you have a de facto top-down hierarchical power exerts power over the people beneath it. And I assume you and I don't really like that and don't think it's workable in the long term. If we were to create a different way of reconnecting people that didn't have geographic boundaries within which a certain political entity had a monopoly in physical violence, and we were to create something using all of the tech that we got at the moment in a way that was actually healing for people in the land, that created connectivity in a way that was generative, what would it look like in your view?
Yeah, I think it's a big question, but I think let's go with a bit what is available or what is out there already. And I think that would be a moment to give a shout out to the people who pursue what we could call ReFi, so regenerative finance, Co-ordiNations. So the notion of Co-ordiNations was coined by Primavera de Filippi and some others who also do research and work in this crypto world, indeed as a counter proposition to the network state idea. And I think that it's a really nice play on word. I'm not a fan of nations, but I'm a big fan of the idea that we coordinate globally in a meaningful way. And they have a really whoever is interested, I would have to see where they have written up their propositions properly and where they are at with their ReFi Coordinations ideas.
Look it up.
But it is really not meant to be something that replaces anything. It's not meant to replace the state. It's not meant to replace anything in an antagonistic way. It's just meant to say all sorts of small-scale bioregional initiatives can gain from being connected, coordinating, and enabling the possibility of scaling in one way or another in a precise and meaningful way, and thereby just enabling more, I would say, livable projects to continue and to expand. So I think that is something where indeed this same idea and these same propositions are taking off in a different direction.
Yeah.
Much less funding. Surprise.
Yes. But perhaps more workable if we can follow the project of making the dollar and all of the USD ones and all the rest of it have no value, then it doesn't matter. What matters is the people and how much they care. And that, I think, might be what it comes down to.
So I mean, this is a difficult. So I think I think that you said it so beautifully, right? For people for whom the biophysical world is an aesthetic option. Amazing. It's really, and people don't believe that is so. And I think that it's really, I do think that there is something that, again, this book that I mentioned already in our last conversation that I'm still thinking through and thinking with exocapitalism, puts forward in a really strong way. That is the way that I read it, or that is the way that allowed me to read it, is that care work, for lack of a better word, or you might call it whatever, life regenerating work, whatever makes life livable and keeps life alive, doesn't scale well.
Yeah.
And these technologies are technologies of scale.
Right.
In all sorts of ways. They are working on modes of reasoning that scale extremely well in numeric languages, in languages that are computational languages, in things where you can just do a lot of things at scale very well.
Right.
But life doesn't scale so well. Right. So I think that this is a question: how do we do this? How do we push back against an economy, as they say, with absolutely no limits, because it scales in its very unencumbered way, in which it has no connection to the living world anymore, and it doesn't need that connection. So in that sense, I do think that
it doesn't need that connection. At some point, it will need oxygen and water and food.
So we humans will need that, no?
Oh,
so
yes,
the question
the
of,
AI doesn't need that. Yeah.
The AI also needs water and it needs resources, but let's see how it's going to go about getting that. It's tricky. So I think that we humans, we have no place, a very little place in this economy that is being built. Our frame of comprehension is minimal. We can make sense of numbers that are I don't know, have more than 3 digits behind the zero. That just doesn't mean anything to us. So our scope in which meaning can live is different. Law is a very deliberative mode of reasoning. It's a human mode of reasoning based on natural language. Machines reason differently. They have different ways of doing. And I think that the economy that is being built is just pushed ever more into that sphere. But I think we just have to build an economy that is independent of that. I think that really the way to go is to go back to bioregional projects, to really living off the land and living well off the land, and
and with the land.
And with the land
is to develop a spiritual basis for life where the living world is not an aesthetic option but is an integral part of how we live is a very different proposition. My goodness. Right, we're running out of time and I know you have to go. So that's amazing. Andrea, I really want to come back for number 3 at some point. Let's give it a while, maybe till the end of the year, maybe even into spring of next year. But this is just, there's so few people I can talk about this with at this level of depth who really get it. And I am so grateful to you for coming onto the podcast. So thank you very much once again, and for highlighting where it is that we need to be paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you.